Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're stepping into a house that shouldn't have worked and somehow worked anyway. Not a castle, not a battlefield, not a palace lit by candlelight. Just an ordinary American home from the middle of the 1970s, sitting on an ordinary street in an ordinary town, looking about as ordinary as a smoothie-colored refrigerator can look. Before we wander in together, a small thank you. This series exists because of the quiet suggestions people leave behind after each episode, a topic here, a request there, and tonight's walk through the 70s came from exactly that kind of quiet nudge. If you're the type who enjoys drifting off inside a piece of history, feel free to settle in, get comfortable, and if you'd like to support the channel, a like or a subscription costs nothing but means everything. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what absurd hour it is where you are, because somewhere always it's 3 in the morning. And if screens aren't your thing tonight, this show now lives on Spotify too, so you can simply close your eyes and listen. Now turn the lights down low, let a fan hum somewhere in the background, and get ready to sink, quite literally, in a moment, into the strangest decade a house ever tried to survive. Ask yourself something before we go in. Why would anyone willingly sleep on a bag of water? Why did a bathroom need to be dressed in carpet, of all the fabrics on earth? Why did families dig a hole in the middle of their own living room and call it progress? Could you sit through a single dinner party balanced on a stool that spins without warning, holding a fondue fork, while a lamp full of wax hypnotizes you into silence? Could you survive an entire evening in a house where every single wall, floor, and ceiling is a different confident shade of brown? Tonight, you get to find out. Congratulations, you have just opened your eyes in the year 1975, in a house that is browner than any house has ever needed to be, on a mattress that is quietly, slowly leaking. Good luck. The water bed we begin, as all mornings do, in bed. Except this bed is not really a bed. It is roughly 200 pounds of tepid water sealed inside a vinyl bladder, resting under a fitted sheet that is doing its absolute best to pretend everything is normal. You do not own a mattress. You own an indoor pond with furniture ambitions. Every time the person beside you shifts, a small tide rolls beneath you. Every time you try to sit up, the whole surface pushes back, as though it has its own opinions about your morning plans. Standing up is less an act of getting out of bed and more an act of being gently, apologetically evicted by physics. The waterbed hadn't come from nowhere. It arrived draped in promises, better posture, deeper sleep, a kind of futuristic romance no ordinary mattress could offer. What the advertisements left out was the maintenance. A waterbed wasn't really furniture. It behaved more like a very demanding houseplant. You had to treat the water with a special chemical conditioner to keep algae from quietly growing inside your bed, a sentence that should alarm anyone hearing it for the first time. You needed a small electric heating pad tucked beneath the mattress, because without one, you'd spend 8 hours losing your body heat to what was essentially a very large, very patient bathtub. And should you ever need to move it, moving day became a full plumbing operation. A garden hose fed through the bedroom window, hours of draining, and a fair amount of praying that none of it ended up on the ceiling of the apartment below. Try to picture actually resting on the thing. You lie down. The water redistributes beneath you like a cautious accountant reviewing your weight. Your partner climbs in, and a wave rolls the full length of the mattress, lifting you an inch into the air before setting you back down. A sneeze sends ripples across the whole surface. A midnight trip to the bathroom turns into a returning tidal event. Making the bed was its own comedy. Tuck one corner of the fitted sheet down, and the sheet's own memory of water motion would pop the opposite corner loose within seconds. You were not making a bed. You were negotiating with one. The truly dedicated households upgraded to the deluxe frame, a padded wooden surround, a mirrored headboard, a little built-in shelf for a lamp, and without any apparent irony, an ashtray. An ashtray resting inches from a giant sack of water and an electric heating coil. Fire safety, it seems, took the decade off. But morning waits for no one, not even someone trapped on an indoor lagoon. You brace yourself, swing your legs over the side, and lower your bare feet toward the floor, a decision that, as you're about to discover, comes with its own set of consequences. The shag carpet, the floor beneath you, is not simply carpet. It is an ecosystem. Long, dense fibers, sometimes reaching 3 or 4 inches, rise up around your ankles like a small, patient jungle that has never once been properly washed. This is not carpet you walk across. This is carpet you wade through, in a fashionable shade of gold or burnt orange, holding a decade's worth of crumbs hostage somewhere beneath the surface. Shag carpet came with its own tool, which tells you everything you need to know about its personality. A wide plastic rake, dragged across the floor to lift the crushed fibers back into a soft, fluffy standing position. You didn't vacuum shag carpet so much as you groomed it, the way you might groom a very large, very stationary pet. Millions of households did this every week without a second thought. The colors were never an accident. Avocado green, harvest gold, rust orange, and a brown so deep it seemed to swallow the light around it, sometimes all blended into the same weave, specifically so that dirt would vanish into the pattern rather than sit visibly on top of it. That wasn't a design flaw. That was the entire design philosophy, and the carpet held on to things. Spill a drink on hardwood and you wipe it away in seconds. Spill a drink on shag carpet and it disappears, sinks down through the fibers to a depth no cloth could ever reach, relocating itself to somewhere just beyond human retrieval. Lose an earring in there, and you may as well have dropped it off the side of a boat. Smoke, pet accidents, spilled fondue cheese, all of it settled into the fibers and stayed for years, quietly composting into what eventually became the house's signature scent. Somewhere in a carpet exactly like this one, a coin dropped in 1972 is in all likelihood still down there. Waiting, feet buried, dignity slightly dented, you lift your eyes off the floor and look toward the walls, hopping for something solid and honest to rest your gaze on. That, it turns out, is a mistake, because the walls of this house are not being entirely truthful with you either. The fake wood paneling, your eyes finally settle on the walls, and it takes a moment for the truth to sink in. These walls are wood the way a photograph of a steak is dinner. Every surface in this room, and very likely every room beyond it, has been covered in thin sheets of dark, glossy paneling, pressed to look like real timber, and doing its very best impression of a hunting lodge, a ship's cabin, or the private study of a man about to deliver news you don't want to hear. Look closer, though, and the illusion falls apart fast. The same knot in the wood grain repeats itself every 16 inches, marching across the wall like a pattern too embarrassed to admit it's printed. This was never solid lumber. It was fiberboard, thin, pressed, and topped with a photograph of wood grain sealed under a shiny laminate coating. It was wood in the same way a wax fruit bowl is breakfast. Installing it required no carpentry skill whatsoever, which is precisely why it spread through the country like a rumor. You didn't need a craftsman. You needed glue, a few finishing nails, and the willingness to cover up whatever ugly plaster, cracks, or water stains were hiding underneath. Within an afternoon, an ordinary living room transformed into what looked like the study of a minor sea captain. It was the decorating equivalent of throwing a blanket over a mess and calling it a finished room. And the color was never subtle. Paneling arrived in shades ranging from brown to a darker brown to please someone turn on a lamp. A room fully wrapped in it absorbed daylight the way a black hole absorbs starlight, meaning that even at high noon, the living room carried the ambience of a cave that happened to own a television set. Reading in a fully paneled room required either excellent eyesight or a lamp held directly against the page. Paneling didn't stop at the living room, either. Some households wrapped the bathroom in it, the kitchen, the hallway. You could walk from a small lodge into a slightly smaller lodge without ever encountering a wall that admitted what it actually was. The real trouble came decades later, when homeowners tried to remove it. Because the panels had been glued directly onto the original plaster, cracks, holes, and all, tearing them down meant uncovering every flaw the paneling had spent years hiding. It was less a renovation and more an exhumation. Knock on one of these walls today and it doesn't sound solid. It sounds hollow, like a drum with delusions of grandeur. Hang a heavy picture frame on it, and the nail slides in far too easily, then wobbles loose within a week. It wasn't a wall so much as a confident suggestion of one. And yet, standing in the dim brown glow of it all, there's an undeniable coziness to the room, like living inside a very large, very committed piece of furniture. You tilt your head back to admire the finishing touch on this timber cocoon, and that's when the ceiling introduces itself. The popcorn ceiling look up, if you're brave enough. Hanging above you, close enough to touch if you stood on a chair, is a bumpy, crumbling, faintly damp-looking texture that everyone in the neighborhood has quietly agreed to call popcorn. No one in this house could tell you exactly why the ceiling needed to resemble the inside of a limestone cave, but there it is regardless, catching dust, casting odd little shadows, and occasionally shedding a small flake directly into the dinner below. Officially, it was called an acoustic ceiling, and there was a sliver of real logic buried underneath the strangeness. The bumpy surface was meant to absorb sound and soften the echo of a room. Whether it genuinely worked is a question for people with far more patience than us. The real appeal was much simpler. This stuff could be sprayed onto a ceiling in minutes, instantly hiding every crack, seam, and rushed patch job above your head. It was less a design choice and more a cover-up applied with a hose. The texture itself, once dry, resembled thousands of tiny stalactites, small peaks and hollows that looked, depending on the light, either like the surface of a distant moon or like a slab of cottage cheese that had been badly startled. And it was maintenance-proof in the worst possible way. You couldn't wash it, because water dissolved the texture into crumbs. You couldn't easily paint it, because the rough surface drank paint like a sponge and shed flakes with every pass of the roller. Bump it with a broom handle, and a chunk would simply detach and drift gently down into whatever you happened to be eating. Worse still, for a long stretch of these years, the spray material often contained asbestos, prized at the time for being cheap, fireproof, and durable. Nobody thought twice about it then. Decades later, that same innocent-looking ceiling became something you couldn't casually scrape off on a Saturday afternoon without releasing fibers no one wanted to breathe. The ceiling, it turned out, had been quietly plotting against its own household the entire time. Try changing a light bulb directly beneath one of these ceilings sometime. You reach up, the texture flakes gently onto your glasses, and you begin to understand with real clarity why so many families simply left the popcorn ceiling alone for 30 uninterrupted years. The wallpaper lowers your eyes from the crumbling heavens, and calm still refuses to arrive, because somewhere in this house, at least one wall is wearing a pattern loud enough to be heard from the street. Enormous psychedelic blossoms, swirling geometric shapes, metallic foil accents that catch the light and shimmer like the inside of a candy wrapper, all of it repeating endlessly, as though the wall itself were slowly having a breakdown. The 70s did not believe in a quiet wall. A blank white surface was treated as wasted potential, a canvas practically begging for the boldest pattern available. So the wallpaper obliged, arriving with flowers the size of dinner plates, orange and brown paisley swirls, and geometric grids that seemed to pulse gently if you stared at them too long. Standing in one of these rooms felt less like being in a home and more like being politely trapped inside a lava lamp. Color, once again, was applied with total confidence and zero hesitation. Harvest gold collided with avocado green, which collided with burnt orange, sometimes on the very same roll of paper, blending into a warm chaos that the entire family somehow adjusted to without comment. There were metallic wallpapers, silver and gold foil catching the light and making a room shimmer. There was flocked wallpaper, raised and velvety, the kind of texture you might absent-mindedly stroke if you were the sort of person who pets walls. The truly committed homeowner didn't stop at a single wall. They wrapped the entire room, added a matching border along the ceiling line, and in rare moments of real ambition, papered the ceiling itself. Picture lying in bed and looking directly up into the same enormous orange blossoms that surround you on all four sides. There was no corner of the room left untouched. You didn't decorate with this wallpaper. You were absorbed by it. Hanging it was its own small ordeal, buckets of wallpaper paste, long soggy strips, and a great deal of shouting between two people trying to line up a pattern that refused to cooperate. Get one strip even slightly crooked, and the entire wall would drift off at an angle, the pattern marching diagonally toward the corner as if it were trying to escape the room entirely. The color scheme stepped back now and take in the whole picture, because the 70s had very strong opinions about color, and those opinions were almost entirely brown adjacent. Avocado green, harvest gold, burnt orange, a deep, muddy brown that can only honestly be described as gravy. These were never accent colors. They were the entire house. The couch was orange. The walls were gold. The refrigerator was green. It all folded together into a single warm, murky stew of a home that felt less like a living room and more like the inside of a very large casserole dish. These shades even carried official names, printed proudly on paint cans and appliance brochures: Avocado, Harvest Gold, Copper Tone, Autumn Haze, reading less like a color palette and more like the menu board of an extremely earnest health food restaurant. And nobody chose just one. Families layered several throughout the house until the entire place looked as though it had been decorated by a very confident bowl of soup. There was, in fairness, a reason behind it. After the sharper, brighter tones of the previous decade, the 70s swung hard toward the natural world, earthy, grounded colors meant to evoke a forest floor or a harvest field. The intention was warmth and calm. The execution was a living room that looked faintly marinated, and because everything matched, the room lost its edges entirely. Where did the couch end and the carpet begin? Drop a brown television remote onto a brown sofa cushion sitting on a brown carpet, and you may as well have thrown it into another dimension. Searching for your keys in a room where every object shares the exact same shade of gold becomes a genuinely frustrating game, and the color always wins. Gently absorbed into this warm brown fog, you feel nature calling. Surely, you think, the bathroom will be a sensible, water-friendly room. Surely no one would do anything strange in there. You have not yet seen the bathroom carpet. The carpeted bathroom. You shuffle down the hallway toward the bathroom, fully expecting the one room in the house built around water to behave sensibly. This, it turns out, is where your optimism runs out. Because somewhere in the middle of the decade, someone looked at the single room in the house dedicated entirely to moisture, steam, and splashing, and decided what it truly needed was soft, plush, wall-to-wall carpet. There is carpet on the floor. There is a fitted cover wrapped snugly around the base of the toilet, like a small fleece collar. There is a matching lid cover, and in the most devoted households, a cozy little sleeve for the tank as well. Your toilet, in other words, is wearing an outfit. It felt warm underfoot, which was genuinely pleasant, right up until you remembered exactly what a bathroom is for. Sit with this for a moment, because it deserves real consideration. A bathroom is by definition the single wettest room in the house. It holds a sink, a tub, a shower, and a toilet, all producing drips, splashes, and steam at every hour of the day. Into this small, humid chamber, an entire decade decided to install a soft, absorbent material that soaks up moisture and never fully dries out. It was, in effect, building a boat out of a sponge and calling it flooring. The carpet did not stop at practicality, and it certainly never achieved it. It got wet constantly, from shower spray, from steam clouds settling on the walls, from the general chaos of a family bathroom in daily use. Unlike tile, it couldn't simply be wiped clean. It absorbed everything, held on to it, and stayed faintly damp in a way that would make an actual swamp a little jealous. Over time, it developed a close, complicated relationship with mildew, and a smell no amount of air freshener could fully negotiate away. You could vacuum it. You could scrub at it with a brush. But the moisture and everything the moisture carried with it had already sunk down into the backing layer where no cleaning product could follow. And yet, at least in the beginning, people loved it. It matched the towels. It matched the wallpaper. It matched the little knitted cover on the box of tissues. Every surface in the room, walls, floor, seat, belonged to the same coordinated earth-tone dream. It was decor pushed to its most enthusiastic, least sensible conclusion. Step out of the shower onto it, towel in hand, and you feel a small, distinct chill of doubt about every decision that led you here, a fuzzy surface, already faintly damp from 1,000 previous showers, waiting patiently beneath your bare feet. You finish up as quickly as dignity allows and retreat toward the kitchen, chasing the smell of breakfast, and there, gleaming in a shade of green that does not occur anywhere in the natural world, the next chapter of this house is waiting for you. The Avocado kitchen appliances. The refrigerator stands at the center of the kitchen, avocado green and proud of it, humming with the quiet confidence of a machine that knows it isn't going anywhere. Beside it, the stove matches. So does the dishwasher. In this decade, appliances arrived less like products and more like flavors. If avocado green didn't suit your taste, there was harvest gold waiting, or a rich, committed shade of copper tone brown. White, notably, was not really an option. White was for the timid. The color truly was the entire personality of the appliance. Manufacturers competed fiercely over which shade would define the era, and avocado green won so decisively that entire kitchens were built around it. Tile, counters, curtains, all bending the knee to a single dominant vegetable tone. When avocado eventually began to feel tired, harvest gold rose to take its place. A warm mustard yellow that looked inviting for roughly 2 years before it started resembling a stain. For those wanting something even more grounded, there was copper tone, a brown so committed it may as well have had its own area code. These machines were enormous, heavy, and seemingly built to survive a direct impact. The refrigerator alone weighed close to what a small pony might weigh, with rounded corners, a thick chrome handle, and a low hum that became the permanent background music of the household. It had no ice dispenser that spoke to you, no digital display on the door. It had one job: keep the food cold, and it performed that job with the grim, unstoppable determination of a machine that fully intended to outlast its owners. That durability cut both ways. On one hand, these appliances essentially never broke. On the other hand, that meant the bright green refrigerator wasn't leaving the kitchen, ever, no matter how badly the fashion around it aged. Long after avocado green had drifted from cutting edge to punchline, the fridge kept humming in the corner, a proud, glowing monument to a color decision that could not be undone without significant expense. The rest of the kitchen fell in line behind it. The stove matched, with its heavy metal burner grates and a broiler capable of producing something close to structural heat. The dishwasher matched too, rolling out from beneath the counter on small casters. Even the smaller appliances enlisted: the toaster, the blender, the canister set on the counter, until the entire room formed one coordinated shade of vegetable. There is, at least, an honesty to it. The 70s kitchen never pretended to be sleek, minimal, or hidden away. It was loud, it was colorful, and it stood by every heavy, humming, deeply green inch of itself. The Formica counters and linoleum floor on your hand along the kitchen counter, and you'll feel it smooth, faintly sticky, swirled in a pattern designed to resemble real stone, if real stone ever came in gold flecks and boomerang shapes. Look down at the floor beneath you, and you'll find linoleum, printed to resemble tile or brick, or occasionally a pattern that resembles nothing found anywhere in nature. This kitchen, like so much of the house, is quietly pretending to be something it isn't, and doing so without a shred of embarrassment. Formica was the star performer here. A hard laminate surface bonded over a wooden core, printed with whatever pattern the imagination could produce. And the imagination produced some genuinely bold choices. Counters flecked with gold to suggest expensive stone, counters printed with repeating boomerang shapes, counters in a single confident sheet of harvest gold, and counters covered in a busy speckled pattern that hid crumbs so effectively you could never quite be sure the surface was clean. The real appeal of Formica, from a practical standpoint, was that it simply didn't care what you did to it. Spill something, wipe it up, done. Set down a very hot pan directly on it, and you'd regret it, but short of an open flame, the material shrugged off scratches, stains, and the daily wear of a busy household without complaint. Underfoot, the linoleum carried the same spirit into the floor. A smooth, springy sheet material, printed to imitate tiles that weren't tiles, bricks that weren't bricks, patterns suggesting a kind of stone that seemed to have only ever been described secondhand. It arrived in large rolls, was glued directly over the subfloor, and could be mopped clean in about 4 minutes flat, no grout lines, no gaps, no fuss. The overriding theme, as you've likely noticed throughout the entire house by now, was cheerful, unapologetic fakery. This was not a home embarrassed by its imitation surfaces. This was a home that looked at the cost and upkeep of real stone and real tile and said, quite confidently, "No, thank you, I'll take the plastic version that wipes clean and outlasts us all." And it did last. Decades later, that same gold-flecked counter would still be sitting there, faded but structurally unbroken, defeating every attempt at a kitchen remodel simply by refusing to wear out. The rotary telephone somewhere in the middle of breakfast, the phone rings, and this begins a small physical journey, because the telephone in this house lives permanently mounted on the kitchen wall, and it is going absolutely nowhere. It's a rotary model, in a color that clashes cheerfully with everything around it. Answering it means walking to it, standing there and staying there. The cord, coiled and stretched over years of use, has knotted itself into a tight little spiral, and there is no caller identification of any kind. You answer every call blind, like a slightly anxious contestant on a game show with no rules explained in advance. Dialing was its own small lesson in patience. You placed a finger into the hole above the number you wanted, dragged the dial clockwise to the metal stopper, and released it, waiting as the wheel slowly clicked its way back to the start before you could move on to the next digit. A phone number full of high digits, 8s and 9s, with the longest trip around the dial, gave you ample time to reconsider the entire phone call before you'd even finished dialing it. Then there was the cord itself, that legendary coiled tether connecting the handset to the wall unit. In theory, it stretched, allowing you to wander a few feet while talking. In practice, it twisted itself into a hopeless knot within days, growing shorter and more tangled with every single use, until the handset dangled at an odd angle from a coil roughly the size of a fist. Because the phone was fixed to the kitchen wall, that spot became, permanently, where all phone calls in the house happened. There was no carrying the call to a bedroom, no wandering out to the porch for privacy. You stood in the kitchen, tethered by the ear, while the rest of the family walked past and absorbed half of your conversation, whether they meant to or not. Teenagers became experts at stretching the cord to its absolute limit, angling around the corner of the doorway for a sliver of privacy that never quite arrived, and every call began as a total mystery. The phone rang, and you had no idea whatsoever who was on the other end: your mother, your boss, a wrong number, or a stranger trying to sell you something you didn't need. There was no small screen to warn you. You simply picked up, said hello, and braced yourself for whatever the universe had decided to send down the line. Finally free of the tangled cord, you hang the heavy handset back in its cradle and turn your attention to something warm and reassuring. Breakfast, waiting in a kitchen full of powders, boxes, and pouches, ready to prove that even the first meal of the day had been fully conquered by modern chemistry. The space-age breakfast with the phone finally back on its cradle. It's time to eat, and breakfast in this house is less a meal than a small triumph of chemistry over food. You pour a glass of a powdered orange drink mix, stirred into water until it turns a shade of citrus that seems to have been described to someone over the telephone rather than tasted firsthand. Beside it sits a bowl of cereal so aggressively colored that the milk itself turns a faintly suspicious shade of pink by the time you're halfway through. Everything on this table has emerged from a box, a pouch, or a can, and every single one of them promises to be instant, easy, and vaguely space-age. Nutrition was never really the point. Convenience was the point, and if the final product also glowed faintly under the kitchen light, well, that was simply a bonus nobody complained about. The powdered orange drink deserves a moment of its own, or something resembling respect. It came as a fine powder, spooned into a glass, topped with water, stirred, and transformed into something orange that had met an actual orange exactly once briefly at a party neither of them enjoyed. It was marketed with the full glamour of the space program, since astronauts had carried it into orbit, which meant that every child gulping it down at the breakfast table felt, for a few minutes, like they were preparing for a lunar mission rather than a Tuesday at school. It was sweet, it was tangy, and it bore roughly the same relationship to actual fruit as a traffic cone. The cereal aisle, meanwhile, was where the decade's imagination ran completely unchecked. Boxes lined the shelves in colors that simply do not occur in nature, each one promising sugar, a cartoon mascot, and a small plastic prize buried somewhere inside the bag. The cereal itself arrived in shapes that seemed to have been designed by someone who had been told, secondhand, what breakfast was supposed to look like, but had never personally witnessed one. The real spectacle came once the milk was poured, slowly shifting to pink, or green, or a murky brown, transformed by the sheer chemical enthusiasm of whatever you were about to eat. You didn't simply eat breakfast in this house. You conducted a small experiment, and then you drank the results. Convenience ruled over every corner of the morning. Instant coffee, brewed from crystals that dissolved into hot water and produced a beverage that was technically coffee in roughly the way a photograph is technically a person. Instant oatmeal, sealed inside individual paper packets. Toaster pastries, launched from the toaster with a filling hot enough to weld sheet metal, wrapped in frosting and fully prepared to injure the roof of your mouth on the first bite. Everything was fast. Everything was processed. And everything arrived in cheerful packaging that promised to save you precious minutes you hadn't realized you needed back. There was a real optimism baked into all of it, if you'll allow the phrase. This was the future arriving directly at the breakfast table. Why squeeze a real orange when science had already bottled the essence of one into a convenient powder? Why prepare a slow, traditional breakfast when a small machine could pop a warm pastry out in under 2 minutes? The whole morning felt like a quiet celebration of modern living chemistry, at long last, conquering the tedious old business of actually cooking food. The nutritional value of it all sat somewhere between questionable and genuinely funny. A typical breakfast in this house contained enough sugar to power a small child clear through to lunchtime and possibly straight through a wall. Nobody was counting. Breakfast was fast, it was brightly colored, and it came wrapped in a box with a cartoon on the front, which at the time was frankly all the endorsement anyone needed. Breakfast finished, crumbs brushed from your shirt, you wander into the living room where the true centerpiece of the entire household is waiting for you. It is enormous. It is made almost entirely of wood. And it is, if you squint, technically a television. The wooden console television. You step into the living room, and there it sits, dominating the entire space like a small shrine. This is not a screen mounted casually on a wall. This is a massive wooden cabinet, roughly the size of a chest freezer, with a modest picture tube set into the center and speakers built directly into either side. It weighs close to what a small horse might weigh. It offers fewer channels than you have fingers on one hand. And changing between them means physically standing up and turning a heavy dial with a satisfying mechanical clunk. Switched off, it functions perfectly well as a shelf. Switched on, the entire family gathers around it, because in this house, the television isn't simply an appliance. It's closer to an heirloom. The word console carries real weight here, and so did the people tasked with ever having to move it. This wasn't so much a television as a large, dignified piece of furniture that happened to contain one. It rested directly on the floor on short wooden legs, its cabinet finished to match the paneling elsewhere in the room, sometimes with sliding wooden doors that could be closed entirely to hide the screen from view, as though the television itself were a mildly shameful secret rather than the true heartbeat of the room. The actual picture, once you found it, was surprisingly small, a modest glowing rectangle embedded in an otherwise vast expanse of wood. Changing the channel was a genuine physical event. There was no remote control worth mentioning, or if there was one, it was a heavy plastic clicker with 3 buttons, two of which had stopped working reliably years earlier. So you got up, walked over, and turned a thick dial that clicked its way through a small handful of channels, often with a second, smaller dial reserved for the higher-numbered stations. The youngest child in the house was frequently drafted into permanent duty as the household's human remote control, sent back and forth to the console on command. The picture itself demanded patience. Switch the set on, and the image slowly bloomed outward from a small, bright dot at the center of the screen, taking its time to fully arrive. Reception depended entirely on the antenna, a pair of metal rods on top of the cabinet, affectionately known as rabbit ears, endlessly adjusted, bent, and twisted, while someone across the room shouted updates on whether the picture was improving or getting worse. On particularly stubborn evenings, the very best reception was only achievable while someone personally stood there gripping the antenna, at which point that family member effectively became furniture for the remainder of the program. Color, for the households lucky enough to own a color set, was a gloriously unreliable feature. Faces on screen occasionally arrived slightly green, or orange, or an alarming shade of purple. And you tuned the color dial entirely by feel, chasing a natural skin tone that always seemed to sit just out of reach. When it worked, it felt like magic. When it didn't, the evening news anchor looked faintly unwell, and everyone simply adjusted to a world where he read the headlines in a shade of tangerine. When the picture did come in clear, though, the whole household gathered. This one enormous wooden set was the true center of the evening, and because there was no other real option, everyone in the house watched the very same program at the very same time. That shared, unavoidable experience made the console television something closer to a campfire than a machine. The one place the entire family reliably ended up together, every single night. The hi-fi stereo system standing beside the television is its noisier cousin, a sprawling wooden cabinet bristling with knobs, dials, and small blinking lights, dedicated entirely to sound. Beneath a smoky plastic lid sits a turntable. Somewhere nearby, an 8-track player waits its turn, and flanking the whole setup are speakers roughly the size of nightstands, fully capable of rattling the windows if anyone in the house worked up the nerve to turn the volume up far enough. Operating the whole arrangement required something close to the confidence of an airline pilot, given how many switches were involved. Properly, this was called the hi-fi, short for high fidelity, and the entire point of it was that music simply sounded better through it than through anything that had come before. This was treated as serious business. A good stereo system was a genuine source of household pride, a status symbol displayed as prominently as any painting on the wall, and its owner treated it with something close to reverence. You did not casually walk over and use the family stereo. You operated it carefully, with clean hands and a respectful attitude, because everyone understood without ever being told directly that this machine had rules. At its center sat the turntable, where vinyl records spun beneath a delicate needle. Playing a record carried its own quiet ritual. You slid the black disc out of its paper sleeve, holding it carefully by the edges to avoid smudging the surface, set it gently onto the platter, and lowered the needle onto the groove with the steady hand of someone performing minor surgery. One careless slip, one scratch, and the record was marked forever, doomed to skip in the exact same spot for the rest of its life. The entire process demanded genuine care, and it turned listening to a record into an occasion rather than background noise. Then there was the 8-track, a chunky plastic cartridge you slid into a slot with a satisfying mechanical thunk. It played on a continuous loop, which was convenient right up until the moment it abruptly switched tracks in the middle of your favorite song, cutting away with a loud clunk to finish the tune later, whenever it felt like it. Nobody ever quite forgave the 8-track for this particular habit, and yet nearly everyone owned a small stack of them anyway, rattling around in a shoebox or wedged into a rack beside the couch. The speakers, though, were the real spectacle. Enormous wooden enclosures roughly the size of small refrigerators, capable of filling the entire house with sound and gently vibrating the popcorn ceiling overhead. Positioning them correctly was treated as something close to a science, and turning them up too loud during a quiet evening was treated as a genuine family emergency. A truly dedicated listener would sit in one specific chair, in one specific spot exactly between the two speakers, eyes closed, listening for small details in the recording that nobody else in the room particularly cared about or could even hear. And then, of course, the controls. A proper receiver came fitted with a bewildering array of knobs, sliders, and switches for volume, balance, bass, treble, and a handful of other mysterious functions most owners never fully understood, but adjusted anyway with great confidence. Small glowing meters bounced gently along with the music. Buttons lit up and did things nobody in the house could quite explain. The whole unit looked less like a music player and more like the control panel of a small spacecraft, and operating it correctly, without triggering a single wrong dial, was treated as a genuine point of household pride. With the great wall of sound humming quietly in the background, you turn away from it and toward the rest of the living room, where, as it happens, the floor itself is about to do something you did not expect. The conversation pit here, we arrive at perhaps the single strangest feature in the entire house, a section of the living room floor that has simply been dropped several steps below everything around it. You descend into it the way you might step down into a shallow indoor pool, except instead of water, this pit is filled with cushions and low, built-in couches arranged in a cozy little square. The idea, as it was originally sold, was intimacy, forcing everyone to sit close together and actually talk to one another. The reality was a decorative trap that unsuspecting guests tripped into, struggled to climb back out of, and quietly dreaded every time a party filled the house. It was sunken. It was fully carpeted. And it was, above everything else, remarkably difficult to leave with any real grace once you were down there. On paper, the whole concept sounded almost romantic. Rather than scattering furniture around the edges of a room the way every previous generation had done, you carved out a lower level in the very center of the floor, ringed it with built-in seating, and created a cozy, enclosed den where everyone naturally faced one another. No television glowing in the corner, no easy distractions, just people, gathered together at a slightly lower elevation, supposedly having the kind of deep, meaningful conversation the pit had been engineered specifically to produce. It was architecture with a genuine social agenda. Descending into it was always a small adventure in itself. There were usually 2 or 3 steps down, often unmarked and blending seamlessly into the surrounding carpet, which meant that any guest unfamiliar with the layout was at real risk of simply walking straight off the edge mid-sentence. People would drift across the living room deep in conversation and suddenly discover the floor had vanished beneath them, performing an ungraceful little stumble directly into the seating below. The conversation pit was, if nothing else, remarkably good at starting new conversations, usually the one that began with, "Are you all right?" Once you were down there, you were, in a very real sense, committed. The pit was a soft, cushioned bowl, and it genuinely did encourage people to sit close and talk. But it also meant that leaving required a small production of its own, hauling yourself up out of the low seating, climbing back up the unmarked steps, all while trying your best to look casual about the whole thing. Slipping away early to refill a drink or use the bathroom became a fully public event. There was no discreet exit available from a hole in the middle of the floor. The pit also created its own strange little social hierarchy. Everyone seated inside it sat below the level of the rest of the room, which meant anyone standing at the edge loomed over the group like a small giant. It made ordinary conversation slightly odd, with people down in the pit craning their necks upward at whoever had wandered over to lean against the railing. It was cozy and mildly awkward in roughly equal measure, which, in fairness, is a fairly accurate summary of the entire decade. And being sunken, the pit naturally collected everything that fell. Dropped snacks, spilled drinks, small toys, occasionally a guest who had descended into it a little too enthusiastically after one drink too many. It was the literal low point of the room, and so it became the place where everything eventually gravitated, a plush little basin of crumbs, cushions, and trapped socializers, waiting patiently to be excavated. For a good while, owning a conversation pit was the height of sophistication, tangible proof that your home was modern, social, and not remotely afraid of a little architectural drama. Climbing back out of it, cushions dusted off, you make your way instead toward the nearest proper couch, only for it to greet you with a loud, unmistakable crinkle the moment you make contact. The plastic-covered couch, you sit down and instantly regret it, because someone in this household has sealed the nicest couch in the house beneath a thick, transparent sheet of plastic that crinkles loudly with every movement and sticks stubbornly to the backs of your legs. This was a proud, widespread tradition. The best furniture in the house was wrapped away in plastic specifically to protect it from spills, stains, sunlight, and somewhat ironically, the very family that actually lived there. The result was a sofa that could never truly be enjoyed, only endured. Hot in summer, cold in winter, squeaky in every season in between. You were preserving this couch for a special occasion that, as it turned out, would never quite arrive. The logic behind it, such as it was, made a certain kind of sense. Good furniture was expensive, and a quality sofa represented a real investment, something a family saved toward and took genuine pride in owning. So naturally, to protect that investment, the entire piece was sealed inside a fitted cover of heavy, clear plastic, shielding the fabric beneath from the grubby reality of everyday life. The couch would, in theory, remain pristine forever, its upholstery preserved in mint condition, fully visible and yet completely untouchable, like a butterfly pinned neatly under glass. The experience of actually sitting on it, however, was a small trial in itself. In summer, the plastic grew warm and clammy, and the instant you sat down in shorts, bare skin fused to the surface with a sound and sensation nobody particularly enjoyed. Standing back up required slowly peeling yourself free with a long, reluctant suction sound. In winter, the same plastic turned cold and equally clammy in the opposite direction, greeting you with a chill that no amount of body heat could fully overcome. There was, put simply, no season in which the plastic-covered couch was genuinely comfortable. It was uncomfortable year-round, almost as a matter of principle. And then there was the sound. Every single movement produced a loud, distinctive crinkle that echoed cleanly through the room. Shift your weight, crinkle. Cross your legs, crinkle. Attempt to settle in and get properly comfortable, and the couch announced your every motion to the entire household, with the enthusiasm of a bag of potato chips being opened. Discreetly sneaking a nap was impossible. Quietly sneaking a snack was impossible. The plastic told on you, every single time. The great irony, of course, was that the couch was being so carefully protected for a special occasion that somehow never came. The plastic was meant to be peeled away when important guests visited, or on some fine holiday, finally revealing the beautiful furniture underneath in all its glory. But that particular day kept not arriving, year after year, until the plastic itself slowly yellowed and cracked with age, having successfully protected a couch that no one in the house was ever actually permitted to enjoy. This same instinct extended well beyond the couch. The good lamps, the good chairs, occasionally even the carpet in the formal living room, all preserved beneath plastic, or cordoned off behind some invisible line no child in the house dared to cross. Often there was an entire room dedicated to this purpose, the good room, kept perfect and entirely unused, a small shrine to a level of company that rarely, if ever, actually materialized. The family lived comfortably in the den and quietly worshipped the good living room from a respectful distance. Peeling yourself off the plastic with a sigh and one final squeak, you go looking for somewhere genuinely comfortable to sit. Your eyes land on a floppy leather sack slumped in the corner of the room, and you decide, against your better judgment, to take your chances with it. The bean-bag chair, if the plastic-covered couch felt far too formal, there was always the alternative waiting quietly in the corner. A bean-bag chair, Essentially a large leather or vinyl sack filled with thousands of tiny foam pellets that shifted and crunched audibly with your every movement. Sitting down in one was always something of a gamble, and standing back up afterward amounted to a genuine physical workout, since the chair offered roughly the same structural support as a large pile of dry autumn leaves. Once you sank in, you had, in a very real sense, become part of the floor, and climbing back out required a coordinated, faintly undignified struggle that everyone else in the room politely pretended not to watch. The bean bag was, in every sense, the anti-furniture, the relaxed, casual rejection of everything the stiff, formal living room represented. There was no frame, no internal structure, no real rules to speak of. It was simply a large, soft bag of tiny beads that molded itself around your body, or more precisely, gradually gave way beneath your body until you were mostly sitting on the floor with a generous scattering of foam beads for company. To a younger person in the house, it represented the very height of relaxed, effortless cool. To anyone slightly older, it looked more like a beige boulder that had quietly given up on life. Sitting down in one required something close to an act of faith. You aimed your body toward the sack, committed fully, and fell backward into it, hoping it would catch you rather than simply part around you and deposit you unceremoniously onto the carpet below. Land well, and the beads shifted and cradled you into a surprisingly cozy little nest. Land poorly, and you ended up wedged into the bag at some strange half-folded angle no chiropractor would ever approve of, slowly sinking deeper with every passing minute. Getting back out was the real event, and everyone in the room secretly watched, because the bean bag offered absolutely no leverage whatsoever. Rising from it demanded a series of genuinely ungraceful maneuvers, a roll, a lunge, a desperate reach for anything nearby stable enough to grab onto. You essentially had to fight your way free of a giant marshmallow, and there was no dignified method for doing so. Elderly relatives approached the bean bag with visible dread, fully aware that going down was the easy part, and coming back up would inevitably become a small public spectacle. Then there was the sound, that constant, soft crunching of thousands of tiny foam beads shifting inside the bag with your every small movement. Settle in, and the chair whispered and rustled quietly beneath you as it slowly compressed under your weight. Over time, the beads packed themselves down, and the plump, generous bean bag of a year earlier gradually deflated into a sad, flat puddle that required regular topping up, assuming you could even find replacement beads to buy, which you usually couldn't. And the great, inevitable tragedy of every bean bag chair was its eventual structural failure. Stressed by years of enthusiastic use, the seams would eventually give way, and when they finally did, the bean bag did not simply tear quietly. It erupted, releasing a wide cascade of tiny, static-charged foam beads across the entire room. Those beads clung to absolutely everything, rolled into every corner of the house, and burrowed permanently deep into the shag carpet, well beyond the reach of any vacuum. You would find stray bean bag beads hiding in that carpet for years afterward, small foam ghosts of a chair long since thrown away. Crunching your way back up out of the bean bag, you brush a stray foam bead off your sleeve, and as the evening light outside begins to fade, the room slowly begins to glow, not from anything sensible, but from a lamp on the corner shelf that has just started, very slowly, to bubble. The lava lamp and amber lighting as evening settles fully over the house, the room begins to glow, and not from anything as ordinary as a normal light bulb. On the shelf in the corner, a lava lamp is slowly warming up, sending fat, wobbling blobs of colored wax drifting upward and back down again in hypnotic slow motion, accomplishing absolutely nothing useful and doing it with tremendous style. Around the rest of the house, the lighting sits dim, warm, and deeply amber, thanks to tinted glass fixtures and low-wattage bulbs that make every single room look like a sunset viewed through a cup of weak tea. Nobody in this decade particularly wanted a brightly lit room. They wanted atmosphere, and atmosphere meant squinting gently at all times while a lamp quietly bubbled away nearby, like a very relaxed volcano that had decided to retire early. The lava lamp itself was a genuine marvel of doing nothing, impressively. Inside a tall glass bottle sat a specially formulated colored wax, suspended in liquid, warmed gently from below by a small bulb built into the base. As the wax slowly heated, it rose in soft, wobbling blobs toward the top of the bottle, cooled, and sank lazily back down, over and over, in an endless, quietly mesmerizing loop. It wasn't really a light source so much as a very slow-moving pet, something to stare at, to zone out in front of, to watch for far longer than any reasonable person really should. It served no practical purpose beyond being genuinely fascinating, and that, as it turned out, was the entire point. You couldn't rush it either. Switch one on for the first time, and the wax sat in a stubborn lump at the bottom of the bottle, sometimes for the better part of an hour, before it warmed enough to begin its slow, wobbling dance. Patience was required. The lava lamp performed entirely on its own schedule, when it was good and ready, and not a moment sooner. The rest of the household lighting followed the exact same philosophy of moody, unhurried dimness. This was never a decade interested in bright, clean, practical light. Fixtures glowed in warm amber tones. Shades were thick, often gold or orange, and bulbs were kept deliberately low and cozy throughout. The overall effect was a home bathed in a kind of perpetual golden dusk, warm, atmospheric, and just barely bright enough to read a book by, provided you held the page reasonably close and didn't mind straining your eyes a little. Hanging fixtures were everywhere, chief among them the great swag lamp, a large glass globe or dome suspended from a length of chain, looped decoratively across the ceiling and plugged directly into a nearby wall outlet, casting a soft pool of light down over the seating below. There were rise and fall lamps hanging low over the dining table, and colored glass fixtures throwing warm patches of amber and gold across the walls. Everything in the room was designed to feel soft, warm, and flattering, and almost nothing was designed to actually illuminate the space to any genuinely functional level. There was a certain honest wisdom buried in it, in fairness. Harsh overhead lighting can be unflattering and clinical, and the warm, dim glow that filled a 70s living room really was undeniably cozy. It hid the dust. It softened the loudest of the wallpaper patterns. It made every small gathering feel intimate and relaxed, transforming the house into something closer to gently suggested than fully lit. A warm, shadowy space where the sharper details blurred pleasantly, and the lava lamp bubbled quietly in the corner like a nightlight built specifically for adults. Sitting in that warm, bubbling glow, your eye eventually drifts toward the corner of the room, where a great knotted web of rope and wooden beads hangs from the ceiling, swaying gently in the breeze from a nearby fan. The macramé and houseplants look toward that corner, and you'll find it, a great tangled web of knotted rope, tassels, and wooden beads, twisted entirely by hand into something somewhere between a piece of wall art and a hammock built specifically for a houseplant. This is macramé, and throughout the 1970s, it was everywhere. Plant holders swung gently from the ceiling on knotted cords. Owls woven entirely from rope stared down from the walls with an expression of permanent, mild concern. Entire curtains were knotted from cord by someone who clearly had a long winter and an enormous amount of spare yarn on hand. It gathered dust steadily, swayed gently in any passing breeze, and added to every room a warm, earthy sense that a very calm, very patient person lived there, and quite possibly owned a loom. Macramé was, at its core, the ancient craft of tying knots and confidently calling the result home decor, and the decade embraced it with total, unreserved devotion. Armed with nothing but lengths of rough natural cord and a great deal of patience, people knotted their way through countless evenings, producing an endless supply of hanging plant holders, wall hangings, and dangling ornaments to fill every corner of the home. It was handmade. It was earthy. It fit perfectly alongside the decade's love of warm tones and natural textures. The hanging plant holder was, without question, the undisputed star of the craft. A web of knotted cord cradled a pot of trailing greenery, and suspended it from the ceiling or a small wall bracket, hanging the plant in midair like a leafy chandelier. Nearly every home had several, dangling in front of windows, swaying gently in doorways, brushing lightly against the heads of taller guests who wandered too close and accidentally set them swinging. And then there was the owl. For reasons history has never fully or satisfactorily explained, the macramé owl became a genuine icon of the era, a wall-hanging shape like a wide-eyed bird, its body knotted entirely from cord, its eyes formed from two large wooden beads, staring out at the room with an expression of permanent mild concern. These owls hung on walls right across the country, and no one could quite say precisely why, only that a home without at least one felt somehow incomplete. The craft didn't stop at owls and plant holders either. Macramé became room-dividing curtains, decorative belts, and vast, elaborate wall hangings that stretched from ceiling to floor in intricate patterns of knots, beads, and fringe. Some were genuinely beautiful, the product of real skill and patience. Others were the ambitious first attempts of someone who had bought a how-to book and far too much rope, producing something that looked less like art and more like a length of cord that had gotten itself into serious trouble. Suspended in all that macramé, and crowding nearly every windowsill and shelf besides, was the greenery, because the 70s home was less a house, at times, and more a lightly managed rainforest. Spider plants trailed from hanging baskets. Ferns exploded outward from macramé slings. A rubber plant in the corner slowly, patiently plotted to take over the entire room. Every flat surface held a pot of something leafy, and the underlying goal was simple: bring the outdoors in, until the line between living room and greenhouse blurred pleasantly. The decade fell hard for houseplants, and it never did anything by half measures. The spider plant, with its long arching leaves and small baby plantlets dangling from thin stems, was practically the mascot of the era, spilling from pots in nearly every home. The rubber plant stood tall and glossy in the corner. Ferns burst outward from hanging baskets, and climbing philodendrons and pothos vines made their slow, patient way up walls and across shelves, extending their reach through the room like something out of a very slow-motion adventure film. Caring for this indoor jungle became a genuine hobby in its own right, complete with rituals, regular watering, misting the leaves to keep the air humid, turning each pot so every side received its fair share of light. A drooping fern felt like a personal failure. A single new leaf was a small triumph, worth mentioning proudly to guests. And of course, an indoor jungle came with distinctly indoor jungle problems. Soil dropped onto the shag carpet below, trailing vines catching on passing shoulders, and any small object unlucky enough to fall into a large pot, a dropped coin, a lost earring, simply vanishing into the soil forever, absorbed as a small, permanent offering to the greenery. Brushing a bit of stray potting soil from your shoulder, you step past the greenery and head toward the fireplace, reaching out instinctively to steady yourself against the rugged stone wall beside it. That's when you notice something isn't quite right. The stone, it turns out, is not stone at all. The fake stone fireplace by now, you've started to notice a pattern, because the fireplace in front of you is not built from real stone, and the accent wall surrounding it is not built from real brick. Both are made from molded plastic and printed panel material, glued carefully into place to look rugged and rustic without carrying any of the weight, cost, or genuine authenticity of the real thing. The 70s loved a convincing fake surface, the way some people love a well-executed magic trick. Faux brick, faux stone, faux wooden beams that were in reality hollow and roughly as light as an empty lunchbox. From across the room, the illusion was genuinely convincing. Up close, it looked exactly like what it was, a suburban house cheerfully cosplaying as a rustic mountain tavern. The decade had discovered, with real enthusiasm, that you could imitate almost any expensive natural material for a fraction of the price, and it dove into that discovery with tremendous energy and very little restraint. Why pay for real brick, with its considerable weight, its cost, and the skilled labor required to lay it properly, when lightweight panels could be printed and molded to resemble brick and simply glued to the wall in a single afternoon. Why haul in real stone at all, when a sheet of molded plastic could deliver the rugged look of a mountain lodge without the accompanying back injury? The faux brick accent wall became a genuine fixture of the era, a stretch of wall covered in panels designed to resemble red brick, frequently placed behind the kitchen stove or wrapped around the living room fireplace. It gave the room a cozy, rustic, farmhouse feeling, or at least the general suggestion of one. Examined up close, the illusion tended to fall apart fast, revealing an oddly regular repeating pattern and the suspiciously smooth texture of a material that had never once seen the inside of a kiln. From the couch, though, bathed in dim amber lighting, it looked almost entirely real. And almost real in this house was more than good enough. Fake stone received the exact same treatment, cladding fireplaces and entryway walls in molded panels designed to mimic rugged natural rock. These panels were astonishingly light enough that an entire wall of supposedly imposing stone could be lifted with one hand, which rather undercut the whole rugged mountain lodge effect the moment anyone actually tried to move one. Knock on it, and it sounds distinctly hollow. Lean against it, and it flexes slightly under your weight. But it looked the part convincingly, and looking the part was, in the end, the entire ambition. Then there were the ceiling beams, those heavy, dark timbers stretching across the ceiling, meant to give the room a sturdy, rustic, old-world character. Except they weren't timbers at all. They were hollow shells of molded foam or lightweight composite material, simply tacked to the ceiling, offering all the visual weight of solid oak with none of the actual weight or the actual oak. A grown adult could lift one clean off its mounting with a single finger. It was structural drama with absolutely no structure and no real drama behind it, appearance, and appearance alone. The whole approach captured something genuinely essential about the decade. This was never a home embarrassed by its own imitations. It embraced them, celebrated them, and glued them proudly to every available surface it could find. Real materials were expensive, heavy, and difficult to work with. Fake ones were cheap, light, and easy, and they let an ordinary suburban house convincingly pretend, at least from across the living room, to be a rustic lodge, a cozy countryside cottage, or a charming old tavern, all without anyone ever leaving the comfort of the modern age. Faintly disappointed and faintly impressed all at once, you take your hand off the hollow stone and wander toward the corner of the room, where the evening's real social activity is just beginning. Tucked against the wall is a small padded counter, lined neatly with bottles and glasses, and it's time to talk about the home bar. The home wet bar. Every self-respecting home in this decade came equipped with its own wet bar, a dedicated little corner outfitted with a padded counter, a small built-in sink, a shelf of mismatched glasses, and enough bottles lined up to open a modest tavern of one's own. Here, the man of the house transformed into bartender for the evening, mixing drinks with names that have not aged particularly well, garnished with maraschino cherries the color of a warning light. There were swivel stools bolted to the floor, novelty cocktail napkins printed with jokes you'd already heard twice, and a small decorative sign making a pun about drinking that everyone had also already heard twice. It was the true social heart of the party, a stage where a grown adult could seriously pretend, at least for one evening, that his basement had become a nightclub. The wet bar earned its name from that small built-in sink tucked into the counter, the single feature that genuinely separated a serious host from an amateur one. A dry bar was simply a cabinet stocked with bottles. A wet bar had actual plumbing, which meant you could rinse a glass, add a splash of water to a drink, and generally operate like a true professional without ever having to abandon your post behind the counter. It was a small convenience that felt enormously sophisticated at the time, transforming an ordinary corner of the den into a genuine command center of hospitality. The counter itself was treated as a genuinely proud fixture, padded and upholstered along the front edge, often wrapped in tufted vinyl the color of a decision you'd regret by morning, with a row of matching swivel stools bolted neatly in front of it. Guests perched on these stools, spun slowly in place, and watched the host perform his evening ritual. Behind the bar hung the essential accessories, small glass racks, narrow shelves lined with liquor bottles, and almost without exception, a mirror positioned specifically to make a modest collection of spirits look roughly twice as impressive as it actually was. The host, for his part, took the entire role seriously. Mixing drinks was treated as a genuine performance, and a good home bartender had his own signature cocktails, his particular techniques, and his well-worn patter to go along with them. The drinks of the era tended to run sweet, brightly colored, and heavily garnished, poured into an assortment of glasses that rarely matched one another, and served with a small theatrical flourish. There was always a jar of maraschino cherries glowing a bright, artificial red somewhere on the counter, a bottle of something lighter reserved for the ladies, and something considerably stronger set aside for the gentlemen. The decoration around the bar completed the fantasy entirely. This corner of the house was where a man could express his personality freely, which in practice usually meant a small collection of novelty items. A decorative sign bearing a well-worn joke about drinking, a set of coasters shaped like something mildly amusing, cocktail napkins printed with cartoons. There might be a small neon sign glowing softly, a string of lights, or a piece of art that would never have been welcome anywhere else in the house. The bar was, in every sense, his own domain, and he decorated it accordingly, like a very small personal nightclub tucked into the corner of the living room. The whole arrangement served as a stage set for the golden age of home entertaining. This was a decade that genuinely loved throwing a party at home, and the wet bar was where those parties truly came alive. Guests gathered around it in a loose semicircle. The host held court from behind the counter, and for a few hours, an ordinary suburban den transformed into something resembling a glamorous lounge, complete with mixed drinks, music drifting over from the hi-fi, and the warm amber glow of the mood lighting reflecting softly off row after row of bottles. Spinning yourself carefully off the stool, drink in hand, you follow the sound of the gathering downstairs, descending into the great paneled kingdom beneath the house, where the real entertaining of the evening is only just getting started. The basement rec room downstairs, past the bar, lies the rec room, the great underground kingdom of the 1970s household. This is the basement, fully transformed with even more wood paneling, even more shag carpet, and a drop ceiling made of flimsy tiles that sag suspiciously in every corner. Down here you might find a pool table, a dartboard, a folding card table, and a whole collection of furniture quietly retired from the rooms above, not quite dead yet but no longer welcome upstairs either. This was where the kids were sent to play, where every party eventually migrated once the evening wore on, and where the smell of the entire decade seemed to gather and settle permanently. Slightly damp, slightly dim and wall-to-wall brown, the rec room was the beating, paneled heart of the whole house. The rec room, short for recreation room, was the household's answer to a simple, practical question. What exactly do you do with an entire basement? And this particular decade answered with tremendous enthusiasm. You paneled the bare concrete walls in that same familiar fake wood grain. You laid shag carpet, or a tougher indoor-outdoor variety, directly over the cold concrete floor. You installed a drop ceiling to hide the pipes and wiring running overhead. And almost overnight, your damp underground storage space quietly became the single most used room in the entire house. That drop ceiling deserves its own mention, because it was both a defining feature of the room and a constant, low-grade source of anxiety. It consisted of lightweight tiles resting in a metal grid, suspended just below the real concrete ceiling, hiding all the exposed pipes and wiring above. It was practical. It was cheap. And it sagged gradually over years of use. Water stains bloomed slowly across individual tiles in strange, spreading continents of yellow and brown, and every so often a tile simply went missing altogether, leaving behind a dark rectangular gap that everyone in the household silently agreed to ignore. The furniture down here formed something like a small museum of the family's own past. Nothing in a rec room was ever new. This was where furniture came to retire, the old couch, replaced upstairs years earlier. The armchair that had clearly seen better decades. The coffee table, ringed permanently with old water stains. All of it eventually migrated downstairs for a comfortable, mismatched second life, entirely unbothered by its own condition. The rec room never needed to impress anyone, and it never tried to. It simply needed to hold people, and it held a great deal of activity. This was the room reserved for games, for hobbies, for the pool table or ping-pong table that dominated most of the available floor space, for the dartboard mounted on the paneling, ringed by a small constellation of stray holes from years of missed throws. It was where the card games happened late into the night, where the kids played on rainy afternoons, where teenagers gathered out of earshot of the adults upstairs, and where every party eventually drifted once the wet bar had finished doing its work for the evening. It was, in every sense, the one room in the house where the rules relaxed. There was no escaping the room's fundamental nature, though no matter how much paneling and carpet was added to disguise it. It was still, at the end of the day, a basement, which meant it stayed slightly cool, slightly damp, and carried its own particular smell, a distinct blend of concrete, old carpet, retired furniture, and the lingering ghost of every gathering that had ever happened down there. It wasn't exactly unpleasant. It was simply, permanently, unmistakably the smell of the rec room. Racking up one final game at the pool table, you notice the evening has worn on, and the whole party is slowly gathering around the dining table upstairs for dinner, where a small pot is already bubbling gently over an open flame, and everyone is being handed a long, oddly formal-looking fork. The fondue party dinner tonight, like so many nights this decade, involves fondue. In the center of the table sits a small pot, bubbling gently over a tiny open flame, filled with molten cheese, hot oil, or melted chocolate depending on the course. Everyone at the table has been handed a long fork and a quiet set of unspoken rules. You spear a small cube of bread, dip it carefully into the communal pot, and try very hard not to lose it somewhere in the depths. Because if you do, tradition demands an embarrassing forfeit in front of the entire table. It was social. It was genuinely interactive. And it was, in its own small way, a mild fire hazard performed directly at the dinner table. For one glorious stretch of the decade, dinner stopped being simply a meal and became, instead, a full group activity involving an open flame. The fondue set was one of the single most popular wedding gifts of the era, which meant that nearly every household in the neighborhood owned one, typically received as a gift and displayed with real pride on a shelf until the next dinner party. It consisted of a dedicated fondue pot, resting on a small metal stand positioned directly above a low burner, keeping its contents warm and molten throughout the entire meal. Around it came a full set of long, color-coded forks, one for every guest at the table, so that each person could reach into the shared pot from their own seat without any real risk of a collision. The classic version, of course, was cheese fondue, a pot of melted cheese kept warm and stringy, into which guests dipped cubes of crusty bread. There was also chocolate fondue reserved for dessert, a pot of rich, warm melted chocolate for dipping fresh fruit and small pieces of cake, delightful and reliably messy in equal measure. And then there was the version built around a pot of hot oil, into which guests dipped raw cubes of meat to cook them right there at the table, an activity that combined the pleasure of dinner with a very real and ever-present risk of a minor burn. Hosting a proper oil fondue was, in a small but genuine way, an act of quiet bravery. The true charm of fondue, though, was always its social nature. Everyone gathered around the very same pot, reaching in together with their long forks, sharing the meal in a way ordinary dinners simply didn't encourage. It slowed the entire evening down deliberately. You couldn't rush a fondue dinner. You dipped, you waited patiently for your morsel to heat through, you chatted with the table, and then you dipped again. A proper fondue dinner could easily stretch on for a full, leisurely, convivial hour or more, which was, in a decade that loved entertaining above almost everything else, exactly the intended point. There were rules, too, and they were taken with real, fond seriousness by everyone at the table. The most sacred of them all was the penalty for losing your food inside the communal pot. If your cube of bread ever slipped off your fork and vanished into the shared cheese, tradition demanded an immediate forfeit. And the forfeits themselves became the stuff of small household legend, ranging anywhere from buying the next round of drinks to kissing the person seated beside you. It added a small, gentle element of danger to the entire proceeding, a genuine reason to concentrate on your dipping technique, and a reliable source of laughter whenever someone inevitably fumbled their fork. Like so many trends of the decade, fondue eventually faded from fashion, and the beloved fondue pot was slowly retired to the back of a kitchen cupboard, brought out less and less each year, until it became a dusty relic of parties long past. But in its moment, it stood as the very height of fashionable entertaining, the centerpiece of countless dinner parties, a warm, bubbling, communal celebration belonging to a decade that never once met a meal it didn't want to turn into a full evening's event. Finishing the last of the fondue, wiping a thin string of cheese from your chin, you hear a voice suddenly crackle through the wall behind you, summoning the whole family from a small speaker box mounted beside the door. The home intercom system mounted on the wall beside the door is a curious little box with a speaker grill and a row of buttons. The household intercom system, designed to let anyone in the family broadcast their voice into any room of the house. In theory, this was the very height of modern convenience, letting a parent summon the children to dinner without the ancient, exhausting effort of shouting up the staircase. In practice, it mostly produced sudden bursts of static, muffled feedback, and the occasional accidental broadcast of a private conversation to the entire household at once. Some models could even pipe music through the walls, whether anyone in that particular room actually wanted to hear it or not. It was space age, it was futuristic, and it was also, almost without exception, broken within a year of installation. The home intercom stood as a genuine symbol of modern living, installed with real excitement in newer and more fashionable homes across the neighborhood. The idea itself was thrilling: a central control panel, usually mounted in the kitchen, wired to small speaker units in every room of the house, allowing a single person to press a button and speak directly to anyone, anywhere in the home. No shouting required. It promised to make the busy modern household run with the smooth efficiency of a well-organized office, all coordinated through the quiet magic of the intercom. The reality, unfortunately, fell somewhat short of the magic. Sound quality was, to put it kindly, poor. Voices arrived crackling and distorted, half swallowed by static, so that a simple message about dinner arrived instead as an urgent, garbled burst of noise that could reasonably have meant almost anything at all. Guests jumped, genuinely startled, when the box suddenly squawked to life on the wall beside them. Children in the house, through sheer repetition, learned to interpret the muffled broadcasts through pure experience, decoding each crackling summons like translators working through a difficult foreign language. The feedback problem was its own special kind of torment. Press the button while standing too close to another active speaker elsewhere in the house, and the whole system erupted into a piercing electronic squeal that echoed through every room and sent the entire family scrambling to make it stop. Operating the intercom without accidentally triggering that shriek required a genuinely delicate touch and more than a little luck, and many households simply learned over time to live with the occasional blast of feedback as the small price of modern convenience. Then there were the accidental broadcasts, the source of countless small household dramas. Leave a button pressed by mistake, and a private conversation, a muttered complaint, or a heated argument would be transmitted live into every single room in the house, to the horror of whoever had been speaking and the quiet delight of everyone else listening in. The intercom heard things it was never really meant to hear, and it shared them generously, whether anyone wanted it to or not. Many models also came fitted with a small built-in radio or music feature, capable of piping tunes throughout the entire home from that central kitchen panel. It sounded wonderful in the sales brochure, music drifting gently through every room of the house. In practice, it usually meant tiny, crackling audio leaking out of a small wall-mounted speaker, whether the occupants of that particular room happened to want it or not. And like the rest of the system, this feature tended to work beautifully for a short while before quietly giving up entirely, leaving behind a dead box on the wall as a small monument to a future that had, in its own way, already come and gone. The textured plaster walls run your hand along the wall in the hallway, and you'll feel it immediately. A deliberate roughness. Plaster swirled and swept into small peaks and ridges, like the frozen surface of a stormy sea. This was the fashionable finish of the decade, sometimes sprayed on thick, sometimes carefully troweled by hand into elaborate swirling patterns meant to evoke the rustic charm of a Spanish villa, at least in spirit if not in geography. It caught the dim amber light dramatically, casting every surface in a kind of shadowy depth. It also caught dust, snagged sweaters passing too close, and quietly scraped the skin off any elbow unlucky enough to brush against it. A smooth wall in the eyes of this particular decade was considered a boring wall, and so texture was applied everywhere with genuine enthusiasm. Plaster was troweled, swirled, stippled, and sprayed directly onto walls and ceilings alike, creating rugged, dimensional surfaces full of small peaks and shallow valleys. The intended look was warm, earthy, and handcrafted, evoking the rustic charm of an old-world villa, or perhaps a cozy Mediterranean cottage. It fit perfectly alongside the decade's broader love of warm tones and natural textures throughout the home. The techniques themselves carried a real degree of artistry when done well. A skilled hand could swirl the wet plaster into elegant fan shapes, sweep it into gentle rolling waves, or stipple it into a fine, soft texture that diffused the light beautifully. Combined with the amber mood lighting found throughout the rest of the house, these textured walls cast subtle shadows and gave every room a genuine sense of depth and craftsmanship. Done well, it truly did evoke the rustic elegance it was reaching for. Not every attempt was quite so skilled, however, and plenty of rooms ended up with a texture that was less elegant sweep and more chaotic scrape, sharp little points and ridges jutting out at random angles. These more aggressive textures carried a genuine bite, and they took a small toll on anyone who came into regular contact with them, which in a house full of people meant, sooner or later, everyone. Brush against it and it caught your sleeve. Lean against it and it pressed sharp little points uncomfortably into your shoulder. Run a bare arm along it and it could genuinely scrape the skin, leaving behind a red mark and a newfound respect for the quiet hostility of your own hallway. It was also, predictably, a dedicated magnet for dust and a genuine enemy of easy cleaning. All those tiny peaks and ridges collected grime beautifully, and there was no straightforward way to wipe them clean. You couldn't run a cloth smoothly across a textured surface like this, and scrubbing at it risked damaging the finish entirely. So the texture simply aged in place, gathering a fine gray film of accumulated years, impossible to fully clean and equally impossible to remove without redoing the entire wall. One more permanent feature destined to outlast the fashion trend that had created it in the first place. The indoor cigarette smoke. Take a slow, deep breath in this house, and you'll notice it immediately. The entire home is gently marinated in cigarette smoke. Throughout the 1970s, people smoked freely indoors. At the dinner table, on the plastic-covered couch, directly beneath the flammable wood paneling, without a flicker of concern for any of it. Heavy glass ashtrays sit on nearly every surface like small monuments, and the smoke drifts steadily upward into the bumpy popcorn ceiling and settles deep into the shag carpet below, where it quietly remains for decades. The walls slowly shift toward a warm shade of yellow that nobody in the house really notices, until the day someone moves a picture frame and finds the bright, untouched rectangle of the original color hiding underneath. Smoking indoors was, quite simply, considered entirely normal, so normal, in fact, that it rarely earned a second thought from anyone. People lit up in the living room, in the kitchen, in the bedroom, comfortably between courses at the dinner table. Guests were offered a cigarette much the way they might be offered a drink, and any considerate host made absolutely sure there was an ashtray within easy reach of every seat in the house. The idea that smoke indoors might present any kind of problem simply hadn't taken hold yet, and so the smoke drifted wherever the people went, which in practice meant everywhere. The ashtray, accordingly, became a genuine piece of household decor, arriving in every imaginable form. Heavy glass ones in amber and smoke tones, weighty enough to double as a small weapon in a pinch. Ornate ceramic versions, novelty ashtrays shaped like animals or printed with a slogan. Elegant standing models on their own dedicated pedestal beside the armchair. Ashtrays were displayed proudly across coffee tables, end tables, kitchen counters, and bathroom shelves alike, filled and emptied as a routine, unremarkable part of simply keeping house. The smoke itself, of course, never simply vanished into the air and disappeared. It rose, it drifted, and it settled steadily into every soft, porous surface throughout the entire home. It sank deep into the shag carpet and quietly took up permanent residence there. It soaked into the curtains, the couch upholstery beneath the plastic cover, and the endless stretches of macramé hanging from the ceiling. It drifted upward and clung to the bumpy popcorn ceiling, which seemed almost purpose-built to catch it. Over the years, the entire house slowly absorbed that smoke like a sponge, storing it away in every fiber it could find. Then there was the color. Slowly, imperceptibly, year after year, the smoke gradually shifted everything toward a warm, yellowish tan. The walls, the ceiling, even the light fixtures, all gaining a faint nicotine-tinted patina so gradual that no one actually living in the house ever consciously noticed it happening. The only real way to see the change was to move something, a picture frame, a clock, a shelf, and discover the small, shockingly bright rectangle of the original color hiding underneath, a tiny window into how the room had looked before the years of smoke quietly had their way with it. The smell, in the end, became the most permanent legacy of all. It seeped so deeply into the bones of the house itself that it effectively became part of the structure, lingering in the carpet, the paneling, the very drywall beneath the wallpaper. An old, faithful ghost that resisted every cleaning product and every open window alike. Stripping it out entirely, decades later, often meant tearing out the carpet, the curtains, and sometimes the walls themselves, because the house had spent an entire decade steadily breathing in smoke, and it had absolutely no intention of ever fully exhaling it again. The land yacht car cracking a window for a bit of fresh evening air, you catch sight of the driveway outside, where the true monument of the household sits gleaming quietly under the streetlight, a car roughly the size of a small boat. Step out to the garage and behold the family car in its full glory. This is a genuine land yacht, long enough to practically require its own zip code, wrapped in gleaming chrome and painted in the exact same earthy tones as the house it belongs to. The interior is a vast, open plain of vinyl and fake wood grain, with bench seats wide enough to comfortably nap across, and a fuel appetite that borders on the genuinely mythical. The garage itself is less a parking space at this point and more a small museum wing, packed floor to ceiling with tools, bicycles, and boxes of things nobody in the family will ever quite get around to opening again. The American car of this era was a magnificent, excessive thing, built on the firm and unshakable principle that more was always, unquestionably, better. These were enormous vehicles, long, wide, and heavy, with vast hoods, sprawling trunks, and enough steel woven through the frame to build a modest bridge somewhere. They floated down the road on soft, cushioned suspension, gliding rather than truly driving, which is precisely how they earned the affectionate nickname land yacht in the first place. Piloting one felt considerably less like ordinary driving, and rather more like captaining a slow, comfortable ship across a wide sea of asphalt. The interior matched the ambition of the exterior in every respect. Inside was a wide, open expanse of vinyl or velour upholstery, with long bench seats stretching across both the front and back rather than individual bucket seats, offering enough room to comfortably seat a small crowd, or for the youngest passengers in the family to stretch out and lie down entirely during a long highway trip. True to the rest of the house, the dashboard and door panels were finished in the same fake wood grain paneling, bringing that beloved faux timber aesthetic right onto the highway, so a family could enjoy the exact same rustic lodge look in the car that they enjoyed back home in the living room. The colors, too, echoed the house directly. Cars arrived in the very same warm, earthy palette that dominated everything else in this decade: deep browns, harvest golds, avocado greens, and burnt oranges, sometimes finished with a contrasting vinyl roof and a generous amount of gleaming chrome trim. The family car and the family home were, in a very real and literal sense, fully color-coordinated, two separate expressions of the very same decade-wide devotion to the tones of autumn, harvest, and soup. The fuel appetite of these enormous machines was legendary, and largely unquestioned, right up until the decade delivered a rather rude surprise in the form of fuel shortages and long, frustrating lines at the gas station. Suddenly, the once glorious, thirsty land yacht looked considerably less like a symbol of prosperity, and rather more like a genuine liability, and the era of the ever larger American car gradually began to reach its natural limit. And then there was the garage itself, which fulfilled its actual stated purpose, housing the car, only on rare occasions. More often, the garage evolved steadily into a vast storage annex, filling gradually with tools, bicycles, lawn equipment, holiday decorations, and an ever-growing collection of boxes containing things no one in the family could quite remember the contents of, but that no one was willing to throw away either. The car itself, ironically, frequently ended up parked outside in the driveway, effectively exiled by the sheer accumulated clutter of the household it was meant to serve. Heading back inside out of the evening chill, you feel it the moment you step through the door, a wave of perfectly controlled, artificially cooled air. This house, as it turns out, has central heating and cooling installed. And that single fact means there is a quiet, ongoing war being waged somewhere over a small box mounted on the hallway wall. The thermostat wars back inside. A quiet battle is already underway, and its front line sits on a small dial mounted in the hallway wall. For the first time in the history of this family's home, central heating and central air conditioning have become genuinely common features, which means the entire household can now argue about the temperature of every single room at once, from a single unified dial. Someone is always too hot. Someone is always too cold. And someone, without ever quite admitting it out loud, has almost certainly adjusted the setting in secret while pretending they hadn't touched it at all. The vents hum quietly overhead, the air blows steadily through the house, and somewhere in the background, the electricity bill climbs a little higher with each passing week. It was, without question, a genuine marvel of comfort and convenience, and it introduced an entirely new form of household conflict that, in one way or another, continues in homes to this very day. Central air conditioning represented a real, rising luxury throughout the decade, and its spread changed daily home life quite dramatically. Where earlier generations had simply sweated through the summer with open windows and a single laboring box fan, the modern home could now be cooled evenly, from room to room, throughout the entire structure. The temperature held steady at a comfortable level regardless of what the weather happened to be doing outside. Cool air flowed silently from vents built into every room, and for the very first time, summer indoors could be genuinely pleasant, rather than merely survivable. The heart of this new comfort was the thermostat itself, that unassuming little dial mounted on the hallway wall, quietly controlling the climate of the entire house from one single point. It was, in its own modest way, a real marvel of home technology, and therein, naturally, lay the entire problem. because a single control point serving a house full of people who all held strong, differing opinions about the ideal room temperature was, inevitably, a recipe for a low-grade, ongoing conflict that never fully resolved itself. The thermostat wars became a new and remarkably enduring feature of family life. One person ran hot and wanted the house cooler. Another ran cold and wanted it warmer. A third worried constantly about the cost and wanted the whole system set to barely functional. And so the dial itself became a small, quietly contested piece of territory, nudged up a single degree by one family member, secretly nudged back down again by another, each adjustment made silently and denied loudly the moment it was noticed. Nobody ever admitted to touching it, and yet, somehow, the setting was always mysteriously different from how it had been left the night before. There was also the matter of the vents themselves, and the surprisingly fierce competition over the best positions in the house. The seat directly beneath a cooling vent became genuinely prime real estate on a hot summer afternoon, and the chair positioned squarely over a heating vent was equally prized once winter arrived. Family members staked out these spots, defended them quietly, and mourned a little whenever they were eventually forced to give one up, all while the great climate control system hummed steadily away in the background, entirely indifferent to the small human drama it had introduced into the household. And humming away quietly alongside it always was the electricity bill. All of this glorious new climate control came with a real cost attached, and running the air conditioning through a long, hot summer, or the furnace through a long, cold winter, added up steadily over time. The very person most worried about that monthly bill was often the same family member caught, again and again, quietly nudging the thermostat back toward a more economical setting, sparking, without fail, the next small round in an eternal, ongoing war. Comfort, it turned out, had arrived in the house at last, and it had brought a monthly invoice along with it. The kitchen gadgets and the trash compactor wisely leaving the thermostat alone for the evening. You wander back into the kitchen for a small snack, where the counter sits crowded with an entire army of humming, whirring, single-purpose machines, each one promising to make your daily life just a little bit easier. The kitchen, it turns out, is not quite finished surprising you tonight, because this decade was thoroughly obsessed with gadgets, and this particular house appears to own every single one of them. There's an electric can opener roughly the size of a small toaster. An avocado-colored blender sits proudly beside it. Proudest of all, tucked neatly into the cabinetry, sits a trash compactor, a machine whose entire job is to crush ordinary household garbage down into a dense, oddly ominous cube, for reasons no one in the family has ever fully managed to explain. Every task a human hand could reasonably accomplish on its own had, somewhere along the way, been reassigned to a heavy, humming appliance in a carefully coordinating color. They cluttered the counters. They jammed constantly and often creatively. They broke down in ways that were never quite predictable. But they were modern, they were electric, and owning them meant, at long last, that you were genuinely living in the future. This was a decade that had fallen deeply, sincerely in love with the idea that any kitchen task, no matter how small or simple, could and absolutely should be handled by its own dedicated machine. Opening a can, once accomplished in a matter of seconds with a small handheld tool, was now the job of a bulky electric can opener that sat permanently on the counter, whirring and grinding its slow way around the lid while you stood there and waited. It was, if anything, considerably slower than the old handheld method. It took up real counter space, and it required its own electrical outlet, but it was electric, and in this decade, electric meant modern, full stop. The counters filled up accordingly, one gadget at a time. There was the blender, finished in a coordinating shade of avocado or harvest gold, ready at a moment's notice to whip up a milkshake or a questionable party dip. There was the electric carving knife, a vibrating, buzzing blade reserved for the holiday roast, an appliance that combined a genuine sense of novelty with a small but very real element of danger. There were electric mixers, coffee percolators, warming trays, and hot plates, each one claiming its own dedicated patch of counter real estate, until the kitchen as a whole began to resemble a small appliance showroom rather than a place anyone actually cooked. But the crown jewel of the entire collection, the proudest and most genuinely baffling gadget of them all, was the trash compactor. This was a large appliance built directly into the kitchen cabinetry, its entire purpose being to crush ordinary household garbage down into a single, dense, heavy brick. You filled it with trash, activated it, and with a powerful mechanical groan, it compressed everything inside into a tightly packed cube, so that your bag of garbage, now weighing roughly as much as a bowling ball, at least took up noticeably less space in the bin. Whether this was genuinely useful in any practical sense remained an open question that few people in the household ever dared to ask out loud. The real appeal behind all of these gadgets was never entirely about necessity. It was about the thrilling, unmistakable sense of living squarely inside the future. This was an age of real technological optimism, and a kitchen filled with humming electric machines stood as visible proof that a family had fully embraced modern living. Each new gadget promised convenience, efficiency, and a small taste of the space age, sitting right there on the counter beside the avocado-colored toaster. The reality, as always, turned out to be a little messier than the brochure had promised. These machines cluttered the counters relentlessly, jammed at the most inconvenient possible moments, and broke down in ways that proved difficult and expensive to repair. The electric can opener gummed up with use. The trash compactor occasionally got stuck mid-cycle. The electric knife eventually stopped buzzing altogether. And slowly, one appliance at a time, many of these single-purpose marvels quietly migrated to the back of the cupboard, gradually replaced once again by the simple handheld tools they had originally been invented to improve upon. Switching off the humming gadgets and dimming the kitchen lights, you take one last, slow look around this glorious, baffling house before the evening finally comes to a close. Closing reflection, and so, as the lava lamp bubbles gently down and the last traces of smoke settle quietly into the carpet, you take one final look around this strange, wonderful home. The brown, the gold, the green, the plastic, the paneling, the conversation pit you kept absent-mindedly tripping into. By every rule of taste we tend to cling to today, none of it should have worked. And yet somehow, taken all together, there is something undeniably warm about it, something bold, cheerful, and entirely unafraid to be strange. This was a decade that looked squarely at an ordinary house and decided without hesitation that it should be fun, comfortable, and completely committed to its own peculiar vision of what a home should feel like. Consider, for a moment, the sheer confidence behind every single choice in this house. The refrigerator was never a cautious, safe beige. It was boldly, proudly avocado green. The walls were never painted a safe, neutral white. They were wrapped instead in giant psychedelic flowers, or clad floor to ceiling in dark, imitation timber. The living room floor wasn't simply a floor, it dropped away entirely into a sunken pit, because someone, somewhere, had decided with real conviction that sitting slightly lower would somehow improve the quality of everyone's conversation. Nothing in this house was ever timid, and there is something genuinely admirable buried in that fact, however loudly we might laugh at the details today. It was also, in its own way, undeniably a home built for the people living in it, rather than for photographs or approval from outsiders. The shag carpet was deeply impractical, but it was warm and soft underfoot on a cold morning. The plastic-covered couch was famously uncomfortable, but it came from a real, genuine desire to protect something the family had worked hard to afford. The fondue pot was, without question, a mild fire hazard, but it brought the whole family and their guests together around one table for a full, unhurried hour of shared conversation. Beneath every strange design choice in this house was a real, sincere warmth, a decade that simply wanted its homes to feel cozy, social, and thoroughly lived in. Much of what filled this house has, in the decades since, become something of a punchline: the avocado appliances, the carpeted bathroom, the endless wood paneling, the macramé owl staring down from its corner of the wall with permanent, mild concern. We look back today and laugh, and fair enough, because a great deal of it genuinely was objectively ridiculous. But every single one of those choices was made by real people, doing their sincere best to make their homes comfortable, modern, and pleasant, using the very best ideas available to them at that particular moment in time. They were never trying to be dated. They were only ever trying to be new. And that quietly is the small lesson hiding underneath all this brown and gold. Every era believes with total sincerity that its own taste is timeless, that its choices are sensible, that its particular style represents the natural, permanent way a home is simply supposed to look. The people who lovingly installed that shag carpet, that faux brick, that sunken conversation pit, were every bit as certain of their own good taste as we are today of ours. They weren't being foolish. They were simply living fully inside their own moment, exactly as all of us do, decorating our lives with whatever feels right to us at the time. So somewhere out there tonight, the quiet ghost of this house still lingers in the yellowed patches of wall hiding behind old picture frames, in stray foam beads still buried deep inside carpets torn out decades ago, in the fading memory of a green refrigerator that hummed steadily away for years and simply refused to die. It was strange. It was loud. It was, in its own quiet way, faintly on fire at all times. And yet it was unmistakably home. And so our own quiet journey through the strangest house in American history comes gently to its close. What a place it truly was. You woke that morning on a slowly sloshing waterbed, sank your bare feet into carpet deep enough to lose a small pet entirely, and wandered slowly through rooms wrapped in imitation wood and giant, blooming psychedelic flowers. You met a refrigerator the color of a smoothie no one had ever actually ordered, a toilet dressed in its own fuzzy sweater, and a living room floor that simply, calmly dropped away into a soft, cushioned pit. You peeled yourself carefully off a plastic-covered couch, wrestled your way free of a bean-bag chair, and sat quietly watching a lamp full of colored wax bubble away in the corner, doing absolutely nothing, and doing it beautifully. It was loud. It was itchy underfoot. It was faintly, gently on fire at nearly all times. And somehow, despite all of it, it was wonderful, because behind every avocado appliance and every knotted macramé owl were real people, quietly trying to make their homes warm, modern, and welcoming, using the very best ideas their own particular moment in history had to offer. They gathered together around bubbling fondue pots. They crowded together in front of one enormous wooden television. They filled every room with plants, with music, and with one another. And they did every bit of it with a confidence we can only really admire from this distance. So tonight, as you drift gently off to sleep in your own quiet home, with its more sensible colors, its uncarpeted bathroom, and its refrigerator that is very probably just plain white, spare a small, warm thought for that gloriously strange, endlessly bizarre decade. It reminds us gently that every era believes its own taste is timeless, and that a home, in the end, was never really about good taste at all. It was always about the people who filled it, the warmth they shared, and the quiet life that filled every brown and golden room. The laundry room, the avocado washer and dryer stepping past the kitchen. You find a small door tucked beside the pantry, and behind it waits the laundry room, a narrow, humming little chamber that somehow manages to be just as loudly colored as everything else in this house. There, standing side by side like a matched pair of stubborn siblings, sit the washing machine and the dryer, both finished in the exact same avocado green as the refrigerator down the hall, because in this decade, even your laundry appliances were expected to match the rest of the household's confident color scheme. These machines were built the way everything else in the house was built, heavy, humming, and seemingly designed to survive a small earthquake. The washing machine had a thick enamel shell, a set of mechanical dials rather than any digital display, and a lid heavy enough to double as light exercise equipment. Starting a load meant physically turning a large dial through a series of clicks, selecting a water level, a cycle, a temperature, and then trusting the machine entirely, because there was no small screen counting down the minutes remaining. You simply waited, and you listened for the telltale change in sound that meant the cycle had shifted from wash to rinse to spin. The dryer beside it ran just as loudly, tumbling clothes with a steady, rhythmic thump that became part of the background music of the house, not unlike the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Dryer sheets were a relatively new convenience, and using one felt like a small modern luxury. A soft, static-free finish that earlier generations, wringing laundry out by hand, could never have imagined. Detergent came in enormous cardboard boxes decorated with cheerful mascots and bold promises of whiteness that no fabric could realistically achieve, and a full box would sit on a shelf above the machines for months, slowly shrinking one scoop at a time. Fabric softener arrived in a bottle colored an alarming shade of blue, poured carefully into a small dispenser drawer that only sometimes actually worked as intended. And then there was the ironing board, folded out from its narrow closet and set up in the corner of the laundry room or occasionally right in front of the console television, so that ironing a stack of shirts could be accomplished while still keeping half an eye on the evening program. The iron itself was heavy, metal, and entirely without any of the modern safety features that would come decades later. No automatic shutoff, no cool touch handle, just a hot metal plate that every household member learned, usually the hard way, to respect. Clotheslines, too, still had their place outside, strung across the backyard between two poles, because even with a perfectly good dryer humming away indoors, there remained something deeply satisfying about sheets that had spent an afternoon drying in the sun, arriving back inside stiff, fresh, and smelling faintly of the outdoors in a way no dryer sheet could ever quite replicate. Ever tried to fold a fitted sheet fresh out of the dryer without it slowly defeating you, corner by corner, until you've simply balled it up and hoped nobody noticed? You cannot win that fight. Nobody ever has. You end up with a lumpy, vaguely rectangular bundle, shove it into the linen closet, and quietly resolve to try harder next time, knowing full well you won't. Leaving the humming laundry room behind, you head toward the quiet study at the back of the house, where papers are stacked neatly beside a heavy black machine that clatters every time it's used. The home office, the typewriter, and the family filing system tucked into the back corner of the house is a small room that doesn't get much use during the day, but comes alive most evenings, the home office, or more often, simply, the den. At its center sits a heavy black typewriter, resting on a wooden desk that has clearly been handed down from somewhere or someone. Beside it sits a stack of carbon paper, a jar of pens, and a rotary-adjacent adding machine that chatters and prints onto a curling roll of paper every time someone tallies the monthly bills. The typewriter itself demanded a very particular kind of physical commitment that modern keyboards simply don't require. Each key needed a real, deliberate press, striking a small metal arm against the ribbon and paper with an audible clack, and typing too quickly risked jamming 2 or 3 of those metal arms together in a small tangled knot that had to be carefully pried apart by hand. Reaching the end of a line triggered a bell, a small mechanical chime warning you it was time to sweep the return lever and start again. Making a mistake meant either careful correction fluid, dabbed on with a tiny brush and left to dry before typing over it, or simply starting the entire page over from scratch, muttering under your breath the whole time. Carbon paper made copies possible, sandwiched between 2 sheets, so that a single typed letter produced a second, fainter version underneath, smudging faintly onto your fingertips if you weren't careful handling it. Filing cabinets stood along one wall, heavy metal drawers stuffed with manila folders holding tax records, warranty cards for every major appliance in the house, and instruction manuals for machines that had stopped working years earlier but whose paperwork nobody could quite bring themselves to throw away. The telephone book sat prominently on the desk too, a genuinely enormous volume listing every household and business in the area, consulted constantly for phone numbers that, before long-distance calling became affordable, connected mostly to people within the same town. Beside it sat an address book, handwritten, updated in pen, with names crossed out and rewritten as families moved and friendships shifted over the years. This was also where the bills were paid by hand, with a checkbook and a careful running balance kept in the small register tucked into the back cover. There was no automatic payment, no digital reminder. Someone in the household sat down once or twice a month, wrote out a stack of checks, licked a stack of envelopes, and walked them to the mailbox, trusting the postal system entirely to handle the rest. Ever tried to correct a typo on the very last line of a freshly typed letter, only to smear the correction fluid before it had properly dried, turning one small mistake into a much larger gluey one? You cannot save that page. You simply pull it from the typewriter, crumple it quietly, and begin again, one clacking key at a time. Setting the typewriter cover back over the machine for the night, you head toward the sliding glass door at the back of the house, out into the yard, where the evening air still carries a faint trace of charcoal smoke. The backyard patio and the charcoal grill step out through the sliding glass door, and the house continues right into the backyard, where a concrete patio stretches out beneath a striped aluminum awning, furnished with a set of chairs upholstered in a woven plastic material that has spent the entire summer slowly baking in the sun. At the center of it all stands the true monument of backyard life in this decade, a heavy charcoal grill standing on 3 legs, its lid propped open, smoke still curling gently from the coals inside. Grilling in this era was never a quick or casual affair. It began, always with charcoal briquettes, stacked carefully into a small pyramid and doused generously with lighter fluid, the sharp chemical smell of it drifting across the yard the moment the match was struck. Lighting the coals properly, and then waiting for them to burn down to the correct shade of gray ash, could easily take the better part of an hour, during which the appointed griller stood guard, tongs in hand, offering opinions to anyone who got too close about exactly when the coals would finally be ready. The grill itself became, much like the wet bar indoors, a small stage for the man of the house, who treated the whole process with a seriousness that bordered on ceremony. There were his particular techniques, his preferred method of arranging the coals, his specific timing for flipping the burgers, and his firm opinions about exactly how well done a steak ought to be. Opinions he was only too happy to share with anyone standing nearby holding a paper plate. The patio furniture told its own story of the decade's priorities. Aluminum-framed chairs strung with woven plastic webbing in bright, sun-faded stripes, a matching chaise lounge angled toward the sun, and a round table with an umbrella that never quite stood up straight in a breeze. A transistor radio sat on the table too, playing quietly, its antenna extended at an angle, tuned to whatever station carried the ball game that particular evening. Citronella candles burned in the corners of the patio as the sun went down, doing a modest job of keeping the mosquitoes at bay while adding their own faint, waxy scent to the evening air. Somewhere nearby, a sprinkler ticked steadily back and forth across the lawn, and the neighborhood carried the layered sound of several other grills doing exactly the same thing at exactly the same hour, up and down the street. Paper plates and plastic cups were the standard here, not out of any real necessity, but because cleanup mattered far more than presentation once the sun went down and the bugs came out. A red and white checkered tablecloth, clipped down at the corners against the breeze, completed the scene, along with a bottle of ketchup and a jar of relish that had probably been sitting in that same spot since the 4th of July. Ever tried to convince a stubborn charcoal fire to catch on a slightly damp evening, fanning it patiently with a paper plate while everyone else at the party grows visibly hungrier by the minute? You cannot rush it. You simply keep fanning, keep waiting, and eventually, gratefully, the coals cooperate. As the sky finally darkens fully overhead, the backyard party begins to wind down and you head back inside, past a bedroom door left slightly ajar, where a very different, much smaller kingdom awaits. The kids' bedroom and a final farewell peek through the slightly open door down the hallway, and you'll find the kids' bedroom, a small, cluttered universe entirely its own. The walls here are papered not in giant psychedelic flowers, but in rock band posters and sports pennants, tacked up with tape that has long since given up any pretense of holding properly. A record player sits on the dresser, smaller than the great wooden console downstairs, but no less cherished, surrounded by a modest stack of 45s in paper sleeves. Shelves along one wall hold an assortment of toys that define the decade just as thoroughly as the Avocado refrigerator downstairs. A metal toy truck with real rubber wheels, a set of plastic building bricks scattered loose across the shag carpet, and a board game or two with a lid that no longer quite closed properly, missing at least one small plastic piece that had long since vanished into the depths of that same shag carpet everyone had learned to fear. A single bunk bed frame stood against one wall, its ladder slightly loose, its top bunk reserved as a matter of long-settled sibling law. A desk in the corner held a small stack of homework, a jar of pencils, and a transistor radio tuned quietly to a late-night station, the thin wire of a single earphone running up to a pillow where a child lay half listening, half drifting toward sleep. The closet door stood slightly open too, revealing a jumble of clothes on wire hangers, a stack of comic books leaning against the wall, and tucked in the back corner, a sleeping bag rolled up and ready for the next unplanned sleepover. String lights, strung loosely around the window frame by hand, gave the room its own small, dim glow, separate from the warm amber lighting found everywhere else in the house. And so, room by room, the great, strange, wonderful house finally falls quiet. The waterbed stops sloshing. The lava lamp finishes its last slow bubble and switches off for the night. The console television, the great wooden altar of the living room, goes dark, its glow fading from the center outward the way it had bloomed to life that very morning. Somewhere down the hall, a record finishes its final rotation and lifts gently off the turntable. The charcoal grill outside cools quietly in the dark, and the shag carpet, having spent another full day faithfully swallowing coins, crumbs, and the occasional dropped earring, simply waits for morning. This house, with all its brown and gold and green, its plastic and paneling and macramé owls, was never really about good taste at all. It was about a family finding its own particular way to be comfortable together, using the best and boldest ideas their moment in history had to offer them. And so, as the last light in the hallway clicks off and the house settles fully into its familiar, smoky, carpeted silence, it's time to let your own eyes grow heavy too. Rest easy now. Let your breathing slow and your mind drift gently into sleep. Good night.